Okay, it is 3 o'clock, so we will start our webinar. I'm so excited to be hosting our first Drupal for Gov webinar of the year, the first of many. This first webinar series will be from Template to Twig, a beginner's guide to bringing designs to life in Drupal. And Ashraf from Debug Academy will be presenting this information. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Drupal for Gov, we're an open source community for developers who have an interest in making government more open to open source. We work within other open source projects, but we started with Drupal. If you want access to any of the lists so that you can get more information about some of the conferences and training days that we provide, please take note of the email address that we have, drupalforgov@gmail.com. So in addition to this monthly webinar series that we're holding, we hold this webinar series every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Except this January is an exception. We're holding it on the 4th, but as a normal, we hold it on the third Thursday at 3 p.m. So in addition to the webinar series, we also hold the yearly conference at NIH for Drupal GovCon. We do the Gov Summit for DrupalCon annually, and we also do the global training days. If you'd like to stay in contact with us, we are on Twitter at GovDrupal and Drupal GovCon, Facebook at Drupal GovCon, and we have a Slack channel, GovDrupal, and the Drupal channel with us, a Drupal Slack with the Gov channel. And lastly, before we get started, we need hosts to present for the Drupal Global Training Days. So if you have the space and the interest, please email us at drupalforgov@gmail.com. Pencil in your calendars that Drupal GovCon will be held this year from July 29th through the 31st. And the Drupal for Gov Training Day is July 28th. Please hold all questions until the end, or rather use the chat. If you have any questions, use the chat to ask any questions. And we have an instructor from Debug Academy, Jack, who will be fielding all of the questions and answering them. So with that said, I'm gonna hand this off to Ashraf. Ashraf, are you here?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can. So I need you to take control of the screen.
All right, got it. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Great. Okay, let me just make sure I have my windows in the right place. I have a couple of hidden Zoom windows that I need to bring here. All right, now I'm good to go. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining me. And thank you, Nika. So GovCon is, like you said, hosted at NIH. I'm actually presenting from NIH today while I host the training there, which is not my usual place to be working from. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be part of this. My name is Ashraf. It's more like the A's in my name are used when you pronounce it. I have all of the Acquia certifications, and that's referred to as being a Grandmaster. So I didn't come up with that phrase myself, but I have the Drupal 7 and 8 Grandmaster certification. I used to work as an architect at Acquia, and I've been working at Debug Academy for the past few years. Let's see. So at Debug Academy, as the name implies, we train individuals and companies looking to learn Drupal, including decoupled Drupal. So React and such is also something that we cover. For any of you who may be interested in learning more after today's session, we have a part-time course. It's 2 3-hour sessions a week, and it actually starts the Sunday after this one. So if you're interested in that, please go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, fill out our contact form, basically get in touch, and we'll talk with you about the part-time semester, which lasts for about 12 weeks or so, and is a good way for people to really become Drupal developers and maybe transition into a career as a Drupal developer. Today, I'm going to try out my laser pointer, and we're going to be talking about Twig. Let's see, with the online session, it's hard for me to gauge the room, so I don't know how many people are coming from a Drupal 7 background, but we're going to primarily focus on Twig in Drupal 8, and I will give a quick comment on TPL files from Drupal 7, as that is what we're transitioning away from if you worked with Drupal 7. TPL files essentially are what we used instead of Twig files in Drupal 7, and those were essentially PHP files. They literally were raw PHP files, and they were used for theming. So because they were PHP files, you had all of the power of PHP, including all of the syntax issues with PHP. As you know, when you're writing HTML, sometimes you need to write quotation marks, sometimes you need to write single or double quotes, and you would find yourself in a situation where when you're writing HTML, you had to escape certain characters because you were writing it in a PHP file. Additionally, you needed to understand the intricacies of PHP syntax in general if you wanted to do anything aside from write plain HTML. And those issues are some of what Twig looks to address. So Twig is used for writing dynamic HTML. You can write your HTML markup, but it can also have things like variables and loops and functions even. It was created with a purpose of being easier to learn than PHP. It's so that your front-end developers don't necessarily need to learn PHP. It does have some functionality from PHP, but it's really a subset of PHP's functionality that is available. And it ends up being much more secure because you don't have the ability to write arbitrary queries in your Twig code. So those are some of the reasons that Twig is used in Drupal 8. So what is some of the valid Twig syntax? There's a lot out there, but I really wanted to highlight the fact that HTML and JavaScript are valid Twig syntax. Yeah. So first of all, in Twig, you do have the ability to print variables out. And that's just like in PHP. You have a variable. The variable can hold some information, be it arrays, integers, decimals, words. That can all be stored in variables. And you can print it out in your Twig file just by using double curly braces. Where do the variables come from? You can create variables in Twig. You can change variables in Twig. You can also essentially inject variables into Twig or pass variables to Twig from PHP. The majority of the variables you will interact with in your Twig files will come from your Drupal modules or even Drupal core. So when you're writing your Twig code, there will be a lot of variables available to you that were given to you by the Drupal application. So I mentioned that HTML and JavaScript are valid Twig syntax. So look at this file on the right. This file is a valid Twig file, and 99% of it is HTML. And that's really the beauty of Twig. If this were done with a TPL file or a PHP file, we couldn't just put the variable directly in the HTML. We would have needed to put an opening PHP tag and a closing PHP tag, and then printed our variable inside of the opening and closing PHP tag, and put a semicolon after the variable, and don't forget the $sign before the variable. So if you do PHP a lot, that might not sound like much, but if you don't, those are a lot of mistakes you can make. So in Twig, you don't really have to worry about that. It's just double curly braces before the variable, double curly braces after, and the rest of your file can just be regular HTML and JavaScript. So that slide showed you how to print variables, which was the double curly braces. Twig does have support for comments as well. So if you want to comment your code, you use a curly brace followed by a $sign on either side of your comment. And this works for multi-line comments. So you can put your curly brace $sign, and then you could write a paragraph or multiple paragraphs of comments followed by another $sign and then a curly brace, and you'll have your multi-line comment satisfied. So in this example, we've got this sentence surrounded by opening and closing comment tags, and it will be ignored when it comes render time because that's commented out code, and when you comment out code, it doesn't run. Any backend developers thinking about annotations, I'm going to leave that out here because it doesn't apply to Twig. So I just talked about HTML, JavaScript, printing variables, and commenting in Twig. You can do much more. You can do conditionals, loops, functions. If you look through the Twig documentation, they refer to it as doing things. There's Twig designed for printing or saying something, and there's Twig designed for doing something. If you are writing Twig which does something, for the most part, you wrap it in curly brace $sign. Okay. So in this example, we're showing what conditionals are like. Again, it's very similar to PHP. If you're comfortable with PHP, you just put the curly brace, the percentage, and then the word if, and then the name of the variable. So in PHP, that would be equivalent to if is empty homepage, and you have your closing tag on the right side. So again, with Twig, there's a real emphasis on minimizing the amount of Twig-specific code you have to write so that you can minimize the opportunity for syntax errors. It's really made to just be less error-prone. And you can do quite a bit. So you could do if is homepage, which will tell you whether the homepage variable is empty or whether it's true. And then if role equals anonymous will tell you if the variable named role contains the word anonymous. And there's not equals. There's other ways to write it as well. You could put the words is space not. So you could say if something is not empty, that would work as well. But at that point, you're diving into the syntax. But the main message is it's made to be very apparent from just reading the code what's happening. Twig also has support for arrays, objects, and loops. In this example, we're doing essentially a for each loop, if you're familiar with that from PHP. So we have this array, all nodes. This is a variable named all nodes, and it contains an array of, you guessed it, nodes. So we can do essentially what's called a for each loop. We do for node in all nodes, and then it'll execute the code in between the for and the end for. And it'll execute that code again and again, once per node in the array. So if you're not familiar with what an array is basically a data type that allows you to store multiple pieces of data. So if you're doing a for loop, it's going to go through every piece of data you're storing one by one and execute the code in between for and end for on each piece of data from the array. Okay, so Twig also has support for functions, again, just like PHP. You won't see people creating new functions in Twig, really, but Drupal core provides Twig-specific functions. Twig itself provides many functions, and if there's a rare scenario where you do need to create your own function, it is possible through a module. But for the most part, you would be using functions that already exist in Twig. So you do that with the print syntax, double curly brace, and then the name of the function, parentheses, and you can pass the argument. So here's the function name, and then here you can pass the parameters to the function. And I'll just call out this example. This is another function which is fairly powerful, the attached library function. It'll actually take a Drupal library which would have JavaScript and or CSS in it, and it'll load that JavaScript and CSS anytime your Twig file loads. So if, instead of doing a PHP hook or something more complicated to associate JavaScript with your Twig file, you can actually just call attach library, and it'll take care of that. And here's just a list of some sample functions available in Drupal. We'll come back to, or we'll move on to the next topic. So Twig filters, somewhat similar to functions. You can pass a variable like content first name. You can write a pipe symbol, and then you could call on a filter, which is somewhat similar to a function. It basically performs some action on the input. So if you pass in a lowercase first name or a lowercase word, and then you pass it through the capitalized filter, it becomes uppercase. If you pass in a lowercase word with a space, pass it through capitalize, and then pass it through trim, it will both capitalize the word and remove the spaces. So you can do quite a bit with Twig filters. This is one of my favorite things about Twig, Twig inheritance. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you can extend classes, and even if you're using components in React or something like that, there's all sorts of benefits to being able to inherit code without literally copying and pasting it. If you copy and paste code into two files, and then you need to make a change to the code, now you have to remember to make the change in both places. So Twig has mechanisms to improve upon that and give you a better experience there. One of them is called the include. Include is similar to PHP includes. It basically means you can take the content from a Twig file and essentially copy and paste it and drop it right into your file. So that's what include does. So if we have this file named body.html.twig, it would copy all of that Twig file and essentially paste it right here. That's what happens when you view this page. Extends is an alternative to include. What extends does is it copies the whole file and it essentially takes the place of your current file. So when you do an extend, you're copying another entire file and printing it similar to what includes does, except you have one extra power. You have the ability over here, block content, you have the ability to override sections of the file that's being included. So this block content notation has nothing to do with Drupal blocks, it's Twig blocks. A Twig block is basically a way to name a section of your file. So if page.html.twig has a section named content, then some other file can extend page.html.twig. It can then overwrite specifically the section named content. So the whole page.html.twig would render except for the content section. The content section would swap with whatever you are putting here, whatever you're overriding it with. The limitation of extends is what I just described is all you're allowed to do. You're allowed to extend a file and override a section of a file. You're not allowed to type above or below the extend. You're not allowed to add arbitrary code. You're not allowed to add a header and a footer on top of the extend and below the extend. Extend expects and requires that it's the only thing, the only source of content in your file. So when you extend something, that has to be the whole file, with the exception of being able to override blocks inside of it. But you're not allowed to add code above or below it. So includes, that we had just talked about, lets you write code above and below it, but it doesn't let you override code inside of it. Extends is the opposite. It lets you override code inside of page.html.twig, but it doesn't let you write code above or below it. If only there were a better way. Embed. Embed actually gives you the best of both worlds. It lets you do what include does. So it lets you just take the code from page.html.twig, drop it into this file. You're still allowed to write whatever you want above it and below it. And you're allowed to override sections of page.html.twig, just like extend. So with embed, you get to do both. There's a lot more to Twig. We didn't even talk about discovering files and such, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But Drupal provides many Twig files, and you can create your own, but you could also override Twig files. So in this example, this is a class project that we had built in our 3-month course, which again starts the Sunday after this one. So this is one of the class projects we built there. We used Twig to override the headers output. The reCAPTCHA module provided a Twig variable, which allowed us to print out this CAPTCHA block using Twig. And there's a donate form, which had an HTML snippet. And because Twig supports HTML, we were able to just drop that into a Twig file. In Drupal, Twig files end with .html.twig. That's not always the case for non-Drupal projects. The Twig files will be placed in a folder named templates in your theme or in your module. And the way it works in the most common case, you put your Twig files in your themes templates folder. And what happens is when Drupal loads a page, it looks in your themes templates folder and says, is there a Twig file there? If there is, it uses it. If there is not, it looks at its parent theme and it checks the templates folder and says, is the Twig file there? If it's not, it looks in its parent theme, and so on until it gets to Drupal core and it finds it in one of Drupal core's themes. If you want to override a specific Twig file, you just have to create a file with the same name and put it into your theme. If you were to enable what's called Twig debug mode, then you would be able to look through your site, and just by looking at the markup of your site, it would tell you exactly what file names can be used. So instead of just overriding page.html.twig, you could specifically override the front page's Twig file by overriding page-front. So just by naming your file page-front, you will override the front page. And here's a look at the markup where they tell you what file names you can use. You can see it's really granular. Node, node-3 if you want to override the Twig file for a specific node. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to move quickly. There are a couple of debugging functions. The dump function will print out the variables on the page. If you go through, if you download the Kint module, you'll get another Kint function similar to dump, but it looks a little better. Twig tweak gives you more Twig functions, such as Drupal view for rendering a view, Drupal block for rendering a block, and so on. It sometimes can, in my experience, it can sometimes break caching on your page, so I don't necessarily recommend it, but it is a popular module. This is just an example of a function, Drupal view. All right, just in time. So again, I will be teaching a part-time course on Drupal development. We go through development environment, Git, Twig in more depth, render arrays, custom module development, a little bit of services and dependency injection, all of that. And we build a real project and look for contribution opportunities every chance we get. So if you're at all interested in participating in that part-time course, we have a free Git class this Sunday in person as a preview. We also have free info sessions coming up next week. So please, feel free to head to our site, debugacademy.com, and sign up for any of those free upcoming events. If you already know you want to take the 3-month course, just go ahead and apply for it, and we'll send you more information. I hope this was useful. I'm going to have to drop off and continue delivering my training at NIH, but you're in good hands with Nika. I believe Jack and Lisa from Debug Academy are both here to answer questions. Thank you all. I'll be dropping off in just a minute.
Okay, thank you, Ashraf.
Thank you.
Okay, oh, I'm sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Sorry, I was just going to say, Nika, you can share your screen, but then you'll take over the presenter role again. And I think that's all we need to do for the handoff.
Okay.
Okay, thank you all.
So are there, Garrett,
Yeah.
I called you by your last
name. That's okay.
Jack is here to answer any questions that anyone may have. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so I've been writing down a number of the questions that are coming in through the chat window. So please continue writing questions into the group chat. I'll try to see all of them as they come in, but hopefully I won't miss any. The first question was, how does it look like for web content accessibility guidelines? And how about for, like, example, screen readers for the blind? So from what I understand, working with Twig is when you write out your Twig syntax, Drupal then translates what you write in the Twig template, so your HTML, CSS or JavaScript, what have you, whatever gets included, and then it all gets compiled, and the browser really just reads kind of the HTML that's rendered out. So it's not necessarily reading your Twig template. So if you write proper semantic HTML, that is kind of standard, that's going to reflect, whatever goals you want to achieve for accessibility, then that should work. So you would kind of just take the same approach, if you would, as if you would be writing regular HTML, because Drupal is going to be doing some compiling before it gets rendered out to the browser.
Yeah, and this is Lisa. Let me just reinforce what Jack just said. So by the time it gets to your browser, none of the Twig code is going to be there anymore. It's going to have been transformed. So as Jack said, if you're writing good HTML and you are using ARIA labels and all the different options you would have that in the HTML that you write in your Twig code, and that's going to get faithfully reproduced, and so you would have all the same benefits, and you'll be set.
So the next question is, like, does Twig has include, does it have a require? And I was chatting with Lisa about this a little bit, because there's not necessarily like a require statement, but include is going to drop in that piece of functionality that you want from another Twig template. I've kind of been doing, some reading about when you would use include. I almost think of it as like a component-based design. You could have a banner.html.twig file, and then you could plop it into your page file, your page.html.twig, which is responsible for what your page looks like, the page design for a Drupal site. And then suddenly that banner would be included on, the page.html.twig design for you. So that's, I think, the closest equivalent per se. I know require statements kind of throw errors, if you will. I'm not a strong PHP developer per se. I'm more of a kind of a front-endy kind of person. But that's kind of like what my answer would be to that. It's really just like, you want that code, you just drop it in. So then the third question is, if embed allows you to do both, right, both include and extend, why would you write out include and extend in your code? And it's something that's kind of tricky. It's not necessarily very intuitive with learning some of these commands in Twig. And I think what you have to do is you have to approach your design and think about what you're trying to achieve. And so if you're trying to include, let me think of like an example here. You want to have let's take the example of like including our banner element that's coming from a separate Twig template called banner.html.twig. And then we want to add it to page.html.twig. So we add it, but then we want to modify our banner for some reason. You could use the embed statement. So you would include it, and then you can then modify it. However, perhaps later in page.html.twig, you want to include another Twig, another Twig template. You can do that. So you would have an embed statement maybe near the top to include your banner element. And then if you wanted to include, like, say, a footer template, well, then you could just say include footer.html.twig. Hopefully that gets to the heart of your question. It's kind of tough to think about this without kind of granular examples per se. I have a few templates actually brought up that I would like to share my screen when I answer everyone's questions, just to show everyone where the templates live in a Drupal 8 site, and you can kind of look at some. And hopefully that would give a little bit of context to some of the code snippets that we've been working on. And then the final question that I've received is, what's the best way to determine what variables are available in a Twig template? And I think that's the question that all developers kind of ask themselves. So we detailed a few of them, which is the dump command. And I think Ashraf mentioned that sometimes you can have memory overloads. Memory overloads. So you have to perhaps use the devel module and use the kint function to kind of see what variables are available to you. And then if you actually go search for this online, you can actually set up your IDE to see what variables are available to you. Also, really important note, the documentation in Twig templates can be very good. And if you look at the top of a Twig template, it will say out of the box what variables you can use in that Twig template. So you might not even have to debug things per se. You can just look at the template and the documentation will tell you, which is really handy. I guess the last part is, once you start working with them kind of intensely, you'll kind of know what variables will be used for a specific template. You get like a little kind of a sixth sense, if you will. So another question I got is every variable we use in a module available in Twig? So this is getting much more advanced per se. So all of variables, not every variable that you have across the site is available to each Twig template. There are Drupal hooks that you need to use to pass information, to pass variables to a Twig template. These are pre-process hooks. There's documentation on Drupal.org. So if you find you're debugging your Twig template looking for variables and you can't find it, you then, this is one method, use a pre-process hook, either from a module or a theme, to help pass the information to a Twig template. And there's multiple kind of ways of doing that. If you just want to target one Twig template, you have a specific pre-process hook. But that's basically how you would go about doing it. If something's not available to you in that template, you have to use that pre-process hook.
Yeah, and let me just also add on to that, that when you're in the hooks, you're essentially, if there's a variable that you need and it's not available to you in Twig, you're going to want to add it to the render array. So that's what when you're in the hook, you're going to add that variable to the render array, and then you can see it in Twig.
So let me share my screen, and I'd love just to show everyone the three kind of Twig templates that I brought up, just for you to kind of get a sense of what they look like in the wild. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Hopefully everyone should see my screen, should see VS Code. And so I have three Twig templates brought up. Let me scooch over to page.html.twig. And what we're looking at is the Bartik theme, the theme that we're all familiar with the default installation of a Drupal 8 site. And at the top, you have a bunch of documentation, and specific to one of the questions, here is available variables, and it kind of tells you there's a variable called base path that you can use. There's one that's called isFront. This one's generally used. It says like, is this template, is it true or false? Is it the front page? And then you have, it details the regions. And then we go on down, and here is what the page of your Drupal site should look like, the broad structure. And it's your proper HTML that you're kind of used to. You have your IDs, and then your curly braces with the variables inside. We've got our if statements. So this one specifically is saying, if something is in the featured top region, please render the HTML. So you can get you can learn a lot just from looking at templates and spending some time with them, even though that may not sound like a thrilling proposition. To talk about kind of the extends functionality is in Bartik. The example that I want to show is we have a block.html.twig, and then we actually have a few different blocks templates as well in this templates folder. So in it's like a mouthful. In block.html.twig, we have essentially what I think of as the blueprint for all Twig templates that are going to be blocks. We kind of have some HTML written, and then we have this statement, the block content, and then we have a div, and then the content variable inside. So this is the blueprint block template. Now, if I look at another block template in the Bartik theme, not all of them, but this one, the system branding block html.twig, you see at the very top, you see it says extends block.html.twig. It's kind of giving, I believe it's a relative path because they live in the same templates folder. So it's saying, I want to extend the blueprint of block.html.twig. And here you go. It says block content and then end block. And so here it's modifying the content that's in block.html.twig. So kind of learning the concepts, you can kind of look inside and see how it's actually being implemented, let's say, in the Bartik theme. This always reminds me, and I apologize, I'm a German history kind of guy. In German, there is a term called the Urpflanze, or Ur, which is like a prefix meaning kind of the original. So like the block.html.twig is like the original block, and all blocks that descend from it will kind of be, descended from the original block.html.twig. So system branding block descends from the Ur block, which is like the block.html.twig template. So that's kind of what I just wanted to quickly show you here. Let me see if look at these questions. Do we need to include file in the sub-theme directory? So to that question, there's a whole kind of thing we need to kind of talk about maybe in another kind of webinar about sub-theming and where to place, our new Twig templates. So if you create a sub-theme, you would place block.html.twig in your templates folder in the sub-theme directory. And Drupal would know to look in your sub-theme directory first. If it did not see block.html.twig in your subtheme directory, it would then go to the next, basically to the base theme. So if you created a subtheme off of Bartik, Drupal would look for your subtheme, block.html.twig. Then it would look at Bartik's block.html.twig. And if for some reason it wasn't there, it would look at the theme that I believe it might be, it's either stable. I think it would look at stables block.html.twig. But essentially, it goes up and up the ladder to get the right HTML template. So I see Paul's question. Let me kind of read it here. It changes the content section, but the rest of the original file of all of the areas will be passed through untouched. Let me make sure. Yes, that is correct. So when you, I believe that's correct. I always like to equivocate a little bit. So, but if you extend something, you're really just changing the block content part of block.html.twig. So this will all remain untouched. So that will all remain there because you are only touching block content in end block. So if I understood the question correctly, because yeah, this is only changing the content block. Okay. All right. Hopefully that answered your question, Paul. Please follow up if that didn't completely answer it, or you know, I can talk about it further. Okay. Any other questions, or if Lisa, you would like to chime in if there was anything that remained unclear, or I kind of. Let me see here. Now, can you extend 2 or more sections in the same extend? I think what you're asking for is, let's say in this example, in block.html.twig, there was another block. I think, yeah, content in the title section. So this would actually have to be, if you wanted to do that, you would have to wrap, this Twig template would have to have a block content wrapped around it as well. So it would be, you know, block label, or maybe I should say title. Let's see. And then you would end it. So end block title. So, but that's only if in the theme that you're inheriting has these blocks. So if you went, let's say you created a subtheme off of Bartik and you edited Bartik's block.html.twig directly, is a very, from what I understand, not a best practices, because you are now editing a contributed theme or a core theme directly. So if you update core, it will blow out the changes that you make to this file. So it's a little bit tricky per se, but if there was a block tags wrapped around it already, you could extend it. Yeah. Okay. I'm not quite sure what project this is probably one of my personal projects I've been working on. I won't save it. So I think I hit everyone's questions. So this is really, I love Twig. I kind of cut my teeth, if you will, on HTML and CSS as I've worked kind of as a web developer. And when I transitioned over to Drupal, I was so sad initially. I was like learning about all these other things. And then once I got to Twig, I was like, oh, finally, things that I'm really excited about. And just something about building and writing content just got me quite excited to kind of get back into the swing of things and write HTML with a little bit more of a complex twist. So part of this is, I took the debug class probably a year and a half ago. As you probably noticed, I actually changed careers from German history. I got an advanced degree. And now I actually just got my front end specialist certification. So, it's definitely possible for all of you to kind of really understand this. It just takes a little bit of time and diligence. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to hand it over to Nika.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack.
You're welcome. There we go.
So there are 3 things that I want to mention before we drop off for this call. After the call, we're going to send out a survey. So please fill it out. That survey helps us improve and get better. And even if you want to recommend new topics, you could do so. The second is we would love to have someone to host for our Drupal half days. So if you're interested, please email us at drupalforgov@gmail.com. And lastly, our next webinar will be in February. We'll send out communications. It'll be February 20th at 3 p.m. and we will send out communications next week. That is it. Again, thank you, Jack, at Debug Academy, and thank you everyone else for attending. And also, yes, you can get the video. We usually post that on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day, afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.